They lived in a land which was fascinating but poor. There was not a more enchanting place on the surface of the earth. Majestic mountain ranges, charming lakes, mountain streams of crystal clear water, ageless glaciers, superb, generous forests. Alpine pasturelands, where the animals that provided the necessary food for daily survival grazed. The valleys were marvelous, but living there was a continuous struggle, even if the mind found it difficult to imagine ever having to break off the link with a land like this. However, the terrible day did come when bitter poverty and hardship triumphed over the natural surrounding beauty. The painful price to be paid for survival was not only leaving the beautiful environment, but also the sacrifice of those things dearest to their hearts, home and family. These courageous people of the Dolomites, the Trentini, could no longer hope for a better future in their own country, and so were forced to turn their eyes in desperation towards other shores where perhaps another crust of bread might be found. From faraway America, word had arrived of abundance and employment. They dreamed of the gold of Colorado, the coal of Pennsylvania, and the huge Brazilian forests as a passport to a more human kind of existence. And so the diaspora of the Trentino people towards the New World began in the second half of the 19th century. That was the start of the first terrible wave of mass immigration caused by crushing poverty and isolation, aggravated by economic and social changes which sometimes became totally suffocating. The immigrants sadly abandoned their valleys and set out for some other European port on their long voyage, often having to be content with a dim corner of the ship's hold. Everything was left behind, and with a trunk which contained only a part of their humble possessions, they set their sights on that world which might or might not be the realization of their dreams. Memories of a church spire, a village graveyard, and a mountaintop mingled with deep emotional feelings, and their swollen hearts overflowed as they burst into song.
America, 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 cosa sarà nostra America? America, 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 nel massolino di fiore.
The first stopping off place on the other side of the Atlantic for those who were going to North America was Ellis Island. This New York Island is still today the symbol of the traumas and hopes of those millions of Europeans that were to form the vital center of the America of the immigrants. The Statue of Liberty was erected opposite Ellis Island, where only the most fortunate managed to escape quarantine. The monument is the work of the Alsatian sculptor Frederick Auguste Bartholdi and was donated to the American nation by the French in 1886 as a symbol of democracy and the universal liberty. The statue was restored between 1984 and 1986 to celebrate the first centennial of its presence at the entrance of the great metropolis of the United States.
My mother arrived in Ellis Island, New York, October the 18th, 1920, with 7 children. We had to stay 2 nights and 3 days because my mother had no more money. So we had to telegraph my father that lived up in Ironwood, Michigan. And we had to wait till he sent the money for us to continue with the journey. And we went by train, and my father met us at the station, and then he took us to live in a house that was owned by the copper mining company. And there we lived for about a year. Then the copper mines went on strike. They had a big strike. So my father left for Hazleton, Pennsylvania, because he knew that there was a lot of our people here. So he left by himself, And then a year later, my oldest sister and brother came to Hazleton and they found work. In the meantime, my mother was waiting in Michigan to be sent for and to receive the money from my father. So then my father sent the money and we arrived in Hazleton on Columbus Day. It was also in October. And my brother found a job there, and as I got older, I found a job working after school. La famiglia era grande, la paga era pochissimo. Io allora ricevevo, lavorando 12 ore al giorno, $5 alla settimana. Ma per aiutare la famiglia ho toccato lavorare.
Many of the first arrivals found work in mines, the coal mines of Pennsylvania and Wyoming, the iron mines mostly in Michigan and Minnesota, and the gold and silver mines of Colorado. It was to learn about what happened to the people who took part in this first exodus that we set out for the United States. We were deeply saddened by images of suffering and death, but greatly encouraged in the endeavor by the generous collaborations of many friends from Trentino living there. On the long journey, the monumental editorial work by Father Bonifacio Bolognani, a courageous people from the Dolomites, provided an extremely valuable guide. Between 1870 and 1910, there were thousands of Trentini working in American mines. This massive workforce did not only include Trentini, but other people from the Alps and low-lying zones as well as various poverty-stricken areas of Europe. There, digging in the bowels of the earth, they labored for their daily bread, a veritable hell. They went to work in totally different areas, even if immigrants from the same valley usually settled down in the same place. Modern generations find it difficult to understand the drama of these immigrants and the nostalgia they carried in their hearts. Loneliness followed their footsteps, and terrible sadness from the absence of their dear ones. Sadness in exile in a foreign country which had the same sky as their homeland, but was so different, so hostile. Maybe it was a richer country, but this did not warm their lonely hearts. At the beginning, extremely primitive methods were used to carry out their work in the mines.
How was the work in the mines like when the old-timers came here?
Many years ago, it was a very, very hard job. These miners came to work early in the morning. They came in about 6 o'clock. They leave at 6 at night. They would work 12 hours a day. They would hardly ever see the sunlight. In fact, in the wintertime, these miners had a very pale complexion because they never had sun on their face. And conditions were quite hard. They worked for a very, very small wage, sometimes as much as only 15 or 20 cents an hour. They had very poor health conditions. When they worked in a mine in the early days, before 1912, they had machines for drilling, and there was no way of keeping the dust down. Now, when they first came here years ago, all they had was a sledgehammer and a hand drill. And they would put a drill in one hand and pound it a sledgehammer, and they would only go maybe it'd take them a week to go 3 or 4 feet. But the mine we're standing in here took 7 years to drill by hand. They only went about 1,200 feet. But nowadays they have all air-operated equipment. And I forgot to mention that in the mine in those days, they had donkeys to pull the iron ore out. And the donkeys working in the mine would go blind. They could never see on the outside, so they always stayed in the mine all their lives.
How deep are we here in this iron mine of Vulcan?
Right now, we're standing about 400 feet underground. But the mine actually goes down below us to 2,300 feet, which is almost half a mile deep.
And the temperature?
The temperature in this mine has always been 42 degrees. It stays that way winter and summer, but it's very damp and humid, and you can contract a cold very easily, a cold or influenza.
The introduction of ventilation and drilling with pneumatic compressors rendered the miners' existence slightly more human. Down there in the deep, narrow, and dank tunnels, the work went on by dim and flickering light.
When the miners first came here, back in the 1880s and 90s, all they had was a candlestick light like I have on my head right now. This showed, in a real dark mine, this gives quite a bit of light. In 1913, the miners over in England invented what they call the carbide light. And from 1939 on, we have now the modern light, which this man is wearing back here.
Those who worked in mines which were not too far from their homes were fortunate. Their families could bring them something hot at midday.
So every day about noontime, you'd see all those miners' children running to the shaft with the buttocks from their father who came up to eat lunch.
But if one worked in particularly isolated and primitive areas, then it was only possible to reach populated centers a few times a year.
Life in the early day mining camps in Colorado was very difficult. The miners had to work hard for low wages. The hours were long, the conditions were very bad. The social life was restricted. The only time they would have any fun was when they would come off the hill and go to the saloons and drink and enjoy the dancing girls.
There were frequent tragic explosions in the mines. In 1923, at Kemmerer in Wyoming, an explosion caused the death of 90 miners, and 14 Trentini immigrants were among the victims. Many also died young, either from accidents or silicosis, leaving widows and orphans in precarious and often desperate economic conditions. Working in the mines was extremely difficult, but it was considered then an honest way of earning one's living.
George, how do you feel when you are working in the mine?
Well, the work in the mine it's hard work, and you get tired, but it's a good feeling because it's honest work. It's not made up work. When a man does this kind of work for a living, he knows he's earned his pay.
The immigrants worked hard, trying to put a few cents aside for their families and dear ones left behind in Trentino. Their savings were sent overseas from post offices, which symbolized hope, the hope of receiving a letter, a parcel, or a postcard from their native country, which would be a confirmation of the love and affection left behind. Their homes were mere shacks, and they lived in patch towns, with several families having to share the same toilet facilities. There was an extremely clear-cut difference between the classes. Owners and bosses lived in comfortable residences, while the miners' hovels had only a few miserable rooms. Very often, a whole family had to live in one room. Even the suggestive landscape setting could not make their homes more pleasant or warmer. The mining companies often imposed impossible conditions on the miners, both at work and in the villages. There were, however, occasions when the hard work and the seriousness of the immigrants was repaid with extreme gratitude and appreciation. The generosity of the Cox family, who owned mines in Pennsylvania, was exemplary.
Here in Hazelton, lived just outside of the city, a few miles out, a lady, she was then a widow already, Mrs. Cox. Her family owned practically all the mines in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. But then when a widow was left with children, she would come forward and if the children were small and the mother had to go work someplace, she would put a woman there and pay her to take care of the children. In fact, it happened to a family called Joseph Facinelli died very young. I don't think he was 30. He left 3 little children. They were probably 1, 2, and 3 years old. They never remembered their father. Then the mother died while they were children. I guess she was brokenhearted. And Mrs. Cox put a woman there to take care of them till they became the age of 16.
It was often difficult to get to know immigrants who belonged to different ethnic groups because of linguistic barriers. There were some important historical contrasts, but often many pacts of solidarity were formed.
The relationship between the ethnic groups in Rock Springs, we had Slovenians, we had Italians, we had Greeks, we had British people, and we all worked in the mines, and we got along very good.
Immigrants who came from the same area had an extremely strong sense of being together, as well as faith.
Our miners and the human relationships were very, very close. What one felt, the other felt. We were together in a lot of things. When one had problems, we got together, we helped one another. It was like just one big happy family.
In an attempt to escape either from unbearable living conditions or in the search of a different type of employment, the immigrants set out even on foot, walking sometimes for more than 1,200 miles across the American plains.
My mother used to tell us a story to us kids, and she was crying. She was telling us a story about her dad, who went to Vulcan, Michigan in 1875, and he worked in the mines, and then there was like a depression, and there was no work, so him and 4 other paisani from Kloss left Vulcan, Michigan, and walked all the way to Pennsylvania. That's at least 1,500 miles walk. It took them 3 months. They used to walk and then stop and maybe find a little work in order to survive, to get food. And many times they had to sneak into the barns and sleep after 10 o'clock at night. And then by 4 in the morning be out and run, because they were treated as bums. They were persecuted like.
There was absolutely no form of social protection or insurance for the worker. The union movement obtained power very slowly and often paid a high price for it in terms of loss of lives. The Ludlow massacre has gone down in history. In an act of repression against striking miners, 21 people, of whom 11 were children, lost their lives.
How much power did the miners have?
Well, in the early ages, early stage of the mining industry, they really did not have any power. They were at the command of the mine owners. There were some things that happened. Legislation was enacted, and the Mine Workers Union came in and negotiated for the miners that changed a lot of the inequities that existed among the mine workers. So Johnny L. Lewis made a dramatic change in the Mine Workers Union, in the mine workers, as he became the president of the mine workers. Also, there were legislation, and one of the major pieces of legislation that affected the mine workers was the child labor law. Children worked in the mines, and it was really a rough situation because they worked from sunup to sundown. They did not go to school. The only thing that they knew throughout their whole lifetime was the difference between slate and coal. That was their job, to separate the two.
The Trentini joined the unions too, and often stood out as leaders.
A man by the name of Cornelius Alexandrini, who was not born, he was born in Trentino, but he came here as a young boy with his parents, and their name was Pietro Alexandrini, and he started a union in these iron mines, and he was one of the labor leaders who later policies were carried out throughout the entire mining industry. He died here several years ago, but north of here at Iron Mountain they have a labor union temple, which is a building where all the labor unions meet now, named after him.
There were also many women who went overseas alone, looking for work.
Signora Maria, cosa si ricorda dei primi giorni quando arrivò negli Stati Uniti?
Well, sono arrivata e ho trovato compagnia, all right, pulito, e ho aveva 8 bordanti, ho cominciato con i bordanti e sono nata partner con il nome, avevano tenuto bestiami, che avevano caure, vacche, cavalli, ruganti, avevano luganeghe e se ne va avanti a quel verso.
Up until 1918, the Trentini who emigrated to America traveled with an Austrian passport, which was held in particularly high esteem on the other side of the Atlantic. Those people felt that they were more Tyrolean than Italian, and this feeling is still very much alive among many of the young generation. It is maintained today in the names given to public places.
The question as to why certain people want to be called Tyrol Austrians as opposed to being called Italians arises from the fact that those people who came to America before the World War I were considered citizens of Austria, and their passports read Austrian Tyrol. My father was one of those people, and his feelings, along with his contemporaries, was such that since they were under the Austro-Hungarian flag, they were citizens and subjects of Franz Joseph, and they took great pride in that.
The first immigrants to leave the Trentino reached Pennsylvania and settled exactly in the area of Hazleton, which was rich in anthracite, the so-called black diamond. The Trentini who settled around Hazleton came mainly from the Val di Non, particularly from Revaux and Castelfondo, and some came from the Val di Sole. The work of the first Trentini increased the prosperity of this area greatly, and as a result, other immigrants settled in the nearby Mount Carmel and Chamacan. The later came mostly from Tuenno, Vigolo Vattaro, and Covelo. The new arrivals also settled in the villages and towns of Freeland, Western Tamaqua, Coaldale, Beaver Meadows, and Pottsville. A large number of immigrants from the Giudicarie Esteriori headed for the northwest part of Pennsylvania and settled halfway between Erie and Pittsburgh. There are many villages which originally consisted only of people from Trentino around Brandy Camp, where immigrants from Bleggio dedicated the Church of the Holy Cross, Force, Brockway, Ridgeway, Brockport, and many others as well, as Rural Valley, Kittening, Yatesboro, Cadogan, McIntyre. The county of Somerset welcomed and provided jobs for immigrants from Tenno and Cologna near Riva del Garda, while people from different parts settled in the coal mining zones of Pittsburgh. These mostly arrived from the Val di Sole, Cavedine, and Vizzano areas. Some of these American names still live in the memory of Trentini, who remember letters or stories by their father or grandfather who worked in the mines. In Hazleton and other parts of Pennsylvania, the Trentini often tried to turn skills they had already acquired in the homeland to advantage or to exploit products which were typical of the Trentino. Damiano, Raffaele, Augusto, and Stanley Genetti, who sold Luganeghe, are an example of this. Today, one of the Genettis is a very important figure on the local economic scene.
What do you especially remember more about the life of your ancestors?
Oh, I remember the stories about my grandfather and the other Tyrolean people who came and had to work very hard in the mines, which was a very dangerous occupation. And that was the only work that was available when they first came to this country, into the Hazleton area. Subsequently, of course, some of them got into other businesses and jobs. In the case of my grandfather, he taught my father when he was 14 how to make sausage, and that got us started in the food business.
How did your family reach such an important position it now holds in Hazleton?
Well, they started in the beginning with one horse and a wagon and a little butcher shop in the back of their house, where my grandfather and my father and his brothers made sausage. And then my grandfather would go out with the horse and the wagon door to door selling the sausage and the meats to the various housewives in their homes.
The bond of solidarity which held the Trentini together was never severed, nor did their faith ever waver, not even in Hazleton. When Pietro Magagna returned to visit Revaux in 1904, he invited Father Ludovico Lucchi from Romallo to come back to America with him. Father Lucchi reached Pennsylvania and became a heaven-sent reference point for their faith and solidarity of Trentino colony in Hazleton. It was on Father Ludovico Lucchi's initiative that a church dedicated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel was built between 1906 and the following year. His nephew, Father Henry, who immigrated from Argentina, continued to serve in this parish.
I'm the Monsignor Mecca, pastor of this church. I succeeded two priests by the name of Father Ludwig Lucchi and his nephew Henry Lucchi, the only two pastors before I came. The church having been founded in 1906 for the benefit of the Tyrolean people alone. In fact, we have a plaque here that reminds us of that. The only Tyrolean church in the world outside of Tyrol. And the people had a hard time in the beginning. Many of them helped build the church with their own hands. They contributed if they couldn't help. And so this has continued. This was actually a section of the city of Hazleton inhabited mostly by Tyrolean people. But times have changed and they have been dispersed, but they are faithful to come back here because this is where they have their roots. And they love their church, and we keep it in nice shape, as you will have seen inside. And the people are very beautiful people.
This church is not the only monument which recalls the past. There is also a Tyrolean cemetery in Hazleton on a piece of land donated by the Cox family. The history of the Trentino pioneers, many of whom died of silicosis when they were still very young, is carved in the tombstones. Many dramatic accidents happened in the lives of the people from Trentino, in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. But even in more recent times, there have been tragic and sensational happenings. To take one example, David Fallon, originally from Reval, was buried alive for 2 weeks in August 1963 in a coal mine owned by him in Oneida, near Shepton. One of the 2 companions who were with him died in the accident.
I'll tell you what. I was opening the mines up, right?
Yes.
I wasn't working for nobody. I was working myself, me and another guy. And we were down 355 feet down, and I go down in the morning and make my inspection. And I must put the date and the day and the date, yes. Put it on right in the last working place. And when I was a couple of more minutes, it was 79 degrees pitch. The slope was like this, just like going on the side of the wall. And it was pretty ticklish work. You had to know what you're doing. And then the guys, the men there says, how about staying down 5 more minutes and help us measure it because you're better at it than us. All right, 5 minutes. I waited there, and they said we loaded some coal and then send the coal up, and then the car come back, and then I have the measurement due, and then I'll send them up, and it'll come back for me, and then I'll come up, and we'll make the timber. It went up, and you know how it is when hell breaks loose? Well, that's what it was. Maybe 5,000 ton of coal fall down.
The close bonds of affection which linked the Trentino community of Hazleton to their native country, and their identification with the symbols which predominated in the Trentino, were reflected in social activities. This was the case among many other communities in the United States. The name of the Tyrolean hero, Andreas Hofer, which was given to the first club, bears this fact out. After various happenings, the club took the present name of Tirolesi Alpini of Hazleton, under the indefatigable guide and inspiration of Emilia de Fant Braschi. Many documents, objects, even shacks, which recall the life of the coal miners in Pennsylvania, and especially in the area of Hazleton, are to be seen and admired in the extraordinary Museum of Eckley, which acquired worldwide fame with the production of the film about the secret sect of Irish miners, Molly Maguire.
You're at Eckley Miners Village, which was formed in 1854. It was a town built for the miners who worked in one of the local coal companies, coal collieries. The first people who came to Eckley were English and Welsh miners who came from abroad, were often brought here specifically to work in the mines. Over the years, the Irish laborers came during the famines and the blights in Ireland, and later on Italians and the Slovak Eastern Europeans. Some of the people that came here were also from Tyrol, and they were particularly valued because of their expertise in tunneling, in mining. And we did have a large contingent of Tyroleans come to mine, not only in Eckley, but in all the mining communities in this area.
Now all the old mines of Hazleton have fallen silent. The energy crisis of the past few years has made it necessary to open new coal mines on the surface. But the picks and shovels of Trentino miners no longer dug out the black diamond. Now gigantic diggers have taken the place of hundreds of men. However, it is perhaps not a coincidence that right there in Hazleton, coal is still dug from what is considered the biggest mine in Pennsylvania, whose owner is of Italian origin.
how has coal mining changed?
Paolo, what you had then was more of a deep mine industry where the people went actually underground to mine the coal. And where we're standing now is where they mined underground, say, 50, 60 years ago. Now we extract the coal by surface mining methods. That is by drilling and blasting the overburden which lays over the coal seam. And then we extract the coal from the surface. Actually, we are in the earth-moving business. We are no longer miners in the strictest sense of the word, but perhaps heavy equipment operators.
What is the future of coal?
Well, here in America, we are actually the Saudi Arabia of coal. We have enough coal to last us 300 years. That is, we don't have to import any coal. We have it right here within the continental United States. The business is, the market for anthracite coal historically has been declining. But, however, in the early 70s, with the energy shortage that we had, the world oil shortage, the coal business is being looked to again to supply the energy needs of our country and the world.
Hazleton's development is mainly due to the miners' work, and it is now an important center, both socially and economically. People of Trentino origin are held in very high esteem here.
What influence had Tyrolean on the development of Hazleton?
The Tyrolean people have made a major contribution to the development of Hazleton here. Those who migrated here early in the century worked right here in these coal mines that where we're here today. They've been very active in the early development of the underground tunnels. There were many Tyrolean people who developed the underground tunnels that led us to the coal seams that in the earlier stages of mining, before we became to the surface mining. They've also added to our culture in the city. We are in Hazleton here. It's to my understanding that we have the one and only Tyrolean church in the entire United States, and we're very proud of that, and we're very happy that the Tyrolean people choose to come here and share their lives with us here in Hazleton.
Apart from Pennsylvania, where the wave of immigrants was especially high, other states too recorded the presence of Trentini in the coal mines. The cold expanse of Montana, especially in the area of Butte, where many Trentini arrived from the Val di Rabbi. West Virginia, especially in the Century and Morgantown, with people from Cavedago. Ohio, with immigrants from the Val di Non. New Philadelphia, Lansing, Lafferty, Flushing, Ericksville, Denison, and other places. People from Cavedine and Brentonico arrived in alliance. Heterogeneous Trentino communities settled also in Kansas, and these immigrants came mainly from Primiero. It is still in coal mining zones that we find Trentino settlers. In the southwest of Colorado, Trinidad, and Walsenburg, and some of them worked in the states of Washington, Idaho, and New Mexico. The coal mines of the far west, especially those of Rock Springs and Superior in Wyoming, deserve treatment in a separate chapter. The boundless prairies and interminable open spaces characteristic of this state heightened even more the already existing nostalgia of these people who came from the valleys of the Alps. The Trentini started to arrive here in the 70s, often after a period of work in Hazleton. Here, too, the people of the Dolomites stood out for their laboriousness. Their deep religious convictions were not shaken by the adhesion of a group of them to a Masonic lodge in Superior, a few miles from Rock Springs. The settlement of the immigrants in the mineral towns of Wyoming, where there are still substantial coal veins even today, is closely linked to the development of the Union Pacific Railroad, a huge engineering undertaking promoted by Abraham Lincoln. The company which owned the railway linking various parts of what are today the United States of America with the Pacific coast did not show much generosity to the miners.
Whenever the Union Pacific said, they run the town, they run the people, where the miners did not work every day. They only worked when they had the whistle blowing. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they could tell whether they were going to come on shift or not. Everything, they had the UP store, and the coal miners were supposed to buy everything from the UP store. They put the miners in debt, and then they were obligated to the Union Pacific Coal Company all the time.
If the coal, by its very nature, made the work of the mines gloomier than it really was, the iron mines of Michigan and Minnesota, which attracted many Trentino immigrants, were not less dismal and depressing. Loreto, Ironwood, Iron Mountain, Norway, Caspian, and Crystal Falls are places associated with a large group of Trentino immigrants who worked there in the iron mines, where the danger of the walls caving in was omnipresent, even if the bats hanging to the cold, damp walls were a sign of greater safety. The center which is most associated with the work of the Trentino immigrants in the iron mines is Vulcan, in Michigan, where the miners built a church dedicated to Santa Barbara, their protectress. The mines in Michigan, too, are now closed. However, the mine belonging to Albert Carollo, whose family is of Trentino origin, has stayed open in Vulcan as a reminder of the past. Now this mine is a tourist attraction. Many visitors flock to it to find out more about the conditions their parents and grandparents worked in. When one goes down into the tunnel, a strange sense of suffering can still be felt today, suffering which is not attenuated even by the marvelous landscape of prairies and woods, which make this part of Michigan an extraordinary palette of colors in autumn. Even here, the hard work put in by the Trentini has earned them an honorable reputation, and this has enabled new generations to find a fitting and dignified place in the community.
In the Upper Peninsula, we have a lot of miners, and most of them, they come from North Italy, and they come a long time ago. And when we moved from Chicago to Upper Peninsula in Norway, we find a lot of nice people, and they right away they find out we are Tyrolean, and we was very welcome.
In Norway, August Mengini has been collecting over the past few years extremely valuable documents and objects which concern the life of the Trentino miners in that important mineral zone in his own private museum. Many receipts for the savings of the miners sent to the Trentino are to be seen there and are the testimony of the sacrifices the immigrants made to help their beloved ones left behind in the homeland.
Now, I'm August Mengini, and I'm born here in this town, and Norway's has at least 1/4 or 1/5 of its population are Tyrols. My dad came from Brits, Baldinon, around 1890, and the area around here had a lot of iron ore miners, and the Tyrols went in the mines, usually in the 3rd Ward area of Norway and the Vulcan area. And sometimes we had as high as 2,000 miners working in this area. And every once in a while you would have a mine accident, and they would bring the people closer together. It was like a large family after you'd have an accident. And some of the Tyrols that made good in this town were Rosati. They come from Valdenone too, as far as I know, and then he was a professional football player.
In 1848, John Marshall discovered gold in California, and then the world discovered California. The enticing news, however, did not have an immediate effect on the migrant flow from the Trentino. It was only after the 70s, the years of the first mass immigration, that Trentini were found working in the gold mines around Sacramento. In 1859, John Gregory discovered the yellow metal in Colorado, but 1875 was the date that marked the immigrants' gold rush towards Colorado. They settled in Leadville, the highest town in North America. The Trentini, who came mostly from Pine, the Val di Non and Val di Cembra, arrived after Croats and Slovenians. Other immigrants from the Dolomites arrived almost simultaneously in Silverton, Telluride, Cripple Creek, Central City, Black Hawk, and Ouray. The landscape of Colorado was so similar to that of the Alps that it provided the Trentini with an ideal natural environment in which to settle down. However, because of the virtually impossible working conditions, this land, rich in gold, witnessed many painful, tragic events, which befell others as well as the sons of the Dolomites. Silverton is situated at an altitude of almost 12,000 feet, and most of its 6,000 inhabitants before 1914 were Trentini. The village is completely surrounded by mountains and is full of snow in winter. The autumn hues are splendid, and the dawns and sunsets are like those of the Dolomites. But now, there are only a few hundred people left in Silverton. All the others have either died or gone away. There is, however, still a group of Trentini. On Sundays, they meet in the little church their parents attended and stand around the altar, which is adorned with unrefined gold. The visitor can still see the entrance to the mines and heaps of sand, which were accumulated in the search for the precious metal. The shaky remains of scaffolding, which were used to lift and weigh the gold, mark the places where the miners suffered and at the same time took hope. Fragments of the yellow metal worn around the neck recall that long past epoch. High up, above the village, stands the miner's Christ, an enormous marble statue transported from distant Genoa. The graveyard is on the slope of a hill. There, the miners from the Alps have found their last resting place, together with other immigrants from all over the world. The victims of the terrible Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 are all buried in a common grave. Silverton, too, has become a tourist attraction. Every day, the train chugs up from Durango, swaying unsteadily on the old, worn rails of a line which was so familiar to those immigrants who set out in search of a crust of bread or in the hope of finding a fortune. The road that leads to this lost center in Colorado is called the 1 Million Highway because it cost $1 million per mile to construct in the 50s. Relics and faded photographs hang on the walls of homes and saloons, reminding us of a now distant past. Yet, there are still some tenacious descendants of Trentino immigrants who nurse a slender hope that one day the mouth of the mine will reopen.
25 years ago, Silverton was a nice place. There were lots of miners. Now all the mines are closed and only a few families have stayed on. 5 or 6 of these are Trentino. All the others have gone away and many are dead. Here we are at an altitude of 12,000 feet. The winter is long and cold and there's a lot of snow. One lives as best one can. Let's hope that one day the mines will reopen and the miners will come back. Who knows?
The fascination of gold prospecting has not altogether died out. Today this precious metal is more profitably extracted from the mines of South Africa and other parts of the world. Even so, it is still possible to find gold panning going on along rivers and streams in Colorado.
Looking for gold must not have been easy here in Colorado.
It was a very difficult life. Many of the people were out alone prospecting or a small group out of a camp. And they would work up the streams, panning to see if they could find small traces of gold. And if so, move upstream until they lost the gold, which meant that somewhere in one of the tributaries there was a source. And then they would pan up the tributary until they could begin to find float rock sitting on the surface, which when they broke it open showed mineralization. Then looking at those rocks, they would then climb up many times up to 12,000, 13,000 feet above timberline where the rocks were exposed and find some of this mineralization in place and then begin to dig and hope they were going to have a strike.
Before Denver ever started to resemble a miniature town, Central City was the main center of development and attractions in Colorado. A short detour off the road between Denver and Central City takes us to a little plateau. At the foot of a hill which is dominated by the shrine of Mother Cabrini, the nun of the immigrants, stands the Paolazzi house. It was built for the children of immigrants by Bartholomew Paolazzi from Faver in the Cembra Valley. Many Trentino people arrived in Central City, but towards 1917, a lot of the mines were closed. The fascinating adventure of Central City had a sad end. Today, it is a ghost town and merely a mecca for tourists. Museums, an old train, art galleries, mines where tools from olden times are exhibited, wagons used for carrying the materials, the opera house, taverns and saloons are all set in a framework of souvenir shops. Central City is only one of the many famous ghost towns. There are others which recall the miners' past. Superior in Wyoming, Virginia City and Nevada City in Montana, for example. The empty houses, abandoned stables, ramshackle old carriages, the school, the church, the saloon bars, streets, and wooden sidewalks are still used as sets for the westerns, full of horses and cowboys. The anguish of so much human suffering and so many sacrificed lives is only revealed to those who stop for a moment to reflect, for the whole picture appears so serene on the surface. Meanwhile, the dead are still there, buried far away from their beloved and so desired land, often forgotten under a broken cross or a handful of weeds.
Uncle Joe Mativi is buried here, near grandfather. After suffering for a long time, he died of consumption at the age of 40, having worked his whole life in the mines. Uncle Fred is buried here. Before he died, he told his wife he would like a pine tree at the foot of his grave. It is here, in memory of his Trentino.
If the Tyrolean cemetery in Hazleton can be considered one of the most symbolic sacred places still visited by the descendant of the first immigrants, the Catholic cemetery in Central City is perhaps the most heart-rending testimony of the miserable end of those Trentino miners who died in America.
I am moved, really moved by a strong feeling of deep compassion and intense shock. Look into these graves, reading those names on the tombstones. I can recapture the suffering of thousands and thousands of our immigrants in the mining camps in the United States of America. In this Tyrolean Calvary of Central City, we can resume the pathos, the sad feeling of our immigrants. We should go in and review tomb after tomb, stone after stone, and try to read the names and the towns, places in Tyrol where our miners came from, and pay attention to the dates of their birth and sacrifice or martyrdom, and think about the fact that nobody thought about them. What to do? What else we can do now? I think this is the only thing we can do, to cry, to suffer, and pray. Yes, because in this unique cemetery, like it is unique parish, the Mount Carmel parish in Hazleton, we do feel, and it can be told, the epopeia, the saga of our miners. And I am convinced that a pilgrimage to this sad place, it can tell us a lot of experience we need for our lives. Look at those graves. Read those names and dates. Miners dead at 40, 45, 50 years old at most, and dead. Yes, many things can be changed in our life, and having a different orientation and dimension. What about reading the dates of the children of 2, 5, 7 months, 3 or 4 years old, not only because they died at the tragic epidemic of flu or Spagnola in 1918, but even because many of them died prematurely, affected by silicosis or mining consumption, or even so-called mal de la mina, of their fathers. Here we have to come from Trentino and from all over the United States and pay a tribute of justice and gratitude to these martyrs. They died, may I repeat, yes, they died so early. And if the villages and towns in Trentino stand socially and economically strong today, so much must be related to these miners who send their money to their families, wives and children. And I do solemnly repeat, because they sacrifice themselves for their families and their native land. To them we should pay this tribute of gratitude and address to them our prayers, our tears. It is, after all, a tribute of justice after years and years of neglect by many of us. Yes, and may they rest in peace.
Nostalgia, suffering, sacrifices, and hard work always dogged the steps of the Trentino miners on American soil. This nostalgia and suffering took tangible form in their songs when they met together. But their strength of character, the mountain fiber and high sense of responsibility towards themselves and their families have always helped the courageous people of the Dolomites to accept and face up to the difficult challenge which the life of an immigrant inevitably is. It is a life which has always been and still remains a struggle.
I'm the daughter of immigrant parents. We've immigrated to the United States 21 years ago. I was born in Belgium of parents who came from the Trentino area. Our life was filled with moving from country to country, knowing that our home was to be Trentino, Bedolo, Pinay, and that one day we were hoping to return. That was the dream of my father and my mother. We had to leave a country that we knew that we went to school and met children and made friendships, and had to come to a new land. We became children of the world rather than having a permanent home. I would not wish other children to be raised in this fashion, because you do not have one home. You go from one place to another. Part of your life is here, part of your life is there, and you never really feel that you're home.
The immigrant of every era has always had its heart divided between two worlds. The affluence he may have acquired in the country that has accepted him can never cancel or wipe out the memory of his native village from his heart.
Luis, what do you feel when you come back to Trentino?
Well, I the sense of belonging because of the warmness of the people that I encounter, and I visit in my town and also down here in Trento. And I like to get this visit here, to come back here because of this warmness and sense of belonging at least once a year and spend a week. I never spend too long of a period of time, but I like to stay here a week or 2 weeks whenever it's possible.
What do you visit, first of all, when you arrive in your village?
Well, as soon as I hit the village, naturally I go down and see my mother and the two brothers that still lives there. And after spending a few minutes with them, I generally visit the cemetery where my father and the uncle and my grandparents are buried. And I'm very proud to visit this location, especially in the last few years, seeing the way that it's maintained, seeing the way that the people really care for the one that preceded us. And it's really and this is the places that I visit generally. And then I meet my friend and we visit other places. And if it's summertime, we leave the mountain, you know, and if not, we spend the time in the town.
The immigrants have never blamed their land for making them leave. If anything, in the past, they have blamed the Trentino for neglecting them, that same Trentino which they always carried in their hearts, and whose genuine values of honest, proud, and noble people they have handed down to their children.
Your Eminence, do you feel your parents had a particular influence on you?
It certainly did. I was very proud of my parents and their Italian heritage. The values which they taught me were very, very important. First of all, they were people of great faith, and I think that my vocation to the priesthood is due in large part to the influence of my parents. In addition to that, they were very good family people. We were a very close family, and this was something that I appreciated very much. In so many ways, they gave me an appreciation of life that I valued very, very much. And so much of this was due to the heritage that belonged to them as Italians.
The new generation, whose representatives have been molded from the sacrifices of Trentino immigrants in the United States, often nurture ambivalent feelings about where they really belong.
I feel, firstly, American, because I think because of my convictions and my personal attitudes, that I have duties and responsibilities to the United States. But I also feel proud that I'm Trentino because of my heritage, of what my parents have given me that I know comes from Trentino, and because of my experiences in Trentino when I was younger.
Not all the Trentino immigrants ended up in the gold, iron, and coal mines. Immigrants from the Giudicaria Inferiori, for example, especially from Pieve di Bono, the Valle di Ledro, and Cavedine, went to work caustic soda at Solvay in the state of New York. A separate chapter has been written by the grinders from the Val Rendena, who initially settled in New York and later extended their activity to all the principal American cities.
But we settled in New York, one at a time, 4 of us, and started doing all kind of work. And finally, after the war, which I served for 4 years in the South Pacific, Australia, New Guinea, and Philippine Islands, and so on, after I came back, I went into the feather business because a brother of mine was in it. And that's how, from the miners' children, became in a feather business, feather dyeing business. And it's been very good to us. We, I think, did our best to try to make it good. And we made a good living for our family, doing all kind of feathers for Hollywood, for the Las Vegas nightclubs, Broadway theaters, all kind of stuff like that.
When mining was at peak of its expansion and the unions had achieved tangible social and economic benefits for their members, the Great Depression and strikes of the 20s forced many Trentino immigrants to abandon the mines in search of work in the big cities. Several returned to their own country.
My mother and dad lived in this town down here. They was Tyrol. And my dad, he sent for my mother, and they got married at the courthouse or the church here in Central City. Now, he worked for 6, 7 years here, and then they returned back to Italy. But the economy over there in Italy at the time, you couldn't earn much money, and they returned to the United States because the money was here.
The exodus from the mines to the city was not easy, but it offered new economic prospects. For the Trentino people, it was the beginning of a new social life. Trentino immigrants have always worked and struggled hard on American soil, but they are the first to acknowledge that despite everything, the American nation welcomed them generously. This generosity has never declined.
Do the United States still show the same generosity towards immigrants they had many years ago?
I think so. We certainly face different problems today than we faced as a nation generations ago when the first immigrants began to come here. But there are many new immigrants who are coming to the United States today. For example, here in the Archdiocese of Chicago, we have hundreds of thousands of people who have immigrated from Latin America. We also have a relatively large number of people who have immigrated from Poland in recent years. And we have immigrants from many other parts of the world as well. And the Church is doing all it can to help these people, to help them become adjusted to their new home, their new life. It's difficult for them at times, but we're giving them the kind of support which we think will help them. At heart, the American people are very, very generous, and they want to help those who come to this land.
Today, in the United States, just as in Canada, South America, Australia, and in various European countries, the Trentino communities are numerous and often consistent in members.
What does Trentino owe to its sons who went overseas in the first wave of mass immigration?
We owe them a lot, because they left to make room for those few who were able to overcome the difficulties at home simply because the others left. 30,000 families emigrated, and consequently those remaining managed to survive the agricultural crisis and the radical changes in traditional crafts and industry at the turn of the century. This is why I believe the association Trentini nel Mondo has sprung up, to give an answer to those young people who want to learn about their origins. It is also to show gratitude to those people for what they have done for our region.
The clubs established by the association Trentini nel Mondo from 1957 to the present day are an important reality. They represent a population which, in number at least, and including the various generations, is almost the same as that living now in the province of Trento. The Trentino people of the present day hold the immigrants in high esteem. It is, however, the miner who remains the classic symbolic figure of the first wave of Trentino immigration to the United States. He still stands as the emblem of that sad page of Trentino history that saw the flower of youth leave the Dolomite valleys to earn a crust of bread underground in the infernal mines. The miner is the symbol of a generation of tenacious workers whose generous savings contributed to a vigorous economic recovery still to be seen today in their native region. It is that miner who, immortalized in marble and bronze statues, becomes spiritually alive once again in the valleys that were taken with the immigrants from the Dolomites to the New World. That miner, with his powerful arms, his kind heart and simple faith, can still move our generation with his song of suffering. That song which reminds us of hopeful and tear-filled eyes towards unknown shores and makes us still reflect on his humble existence.